Okay, slightly after 12, but the hearings are now resumed. Just a general point, if those joining us virtually, I think we are experiencing a few technical difficulties, but if you could just make sure that you're muted, please, unless you're speaking. Ms. Butler, just reflecting on the points made about Morden just before the adjournment, was there anything in particular you wanted to add? Or would you prefer to leave it until that particular session?
Very briefly, the Morden Station Planning Brief 2014 is not part of our examination library. It is still a supplementary planning document. It hasn't been withdrawn, but it's not something we've relied on. The information about the Mr. Straw's client site being a landmark building simply is that. Landmark doesn't mean tall necessarily. There's no definition of that. The information in Morden Station Supplementary Planning Document is based on work done in 2010, which has a different approach to taller buildings for Morden. In fact, it says that I think this building should be the pinnacle. So I think as a council, should this local plan will be adopted, it's clear that there may be a conflict and that the supplementary planning document would have to be, which is nearly 10 years old, would have to be brought up to date or withdrawn and brought up to date. Second point on the opportunity area, very briefly, as we said last week, we are in touch with the GLA on this. It is the GLA who lead opportunity area planning frameworks. And we don't believe that this local plan, or indeed any of London's local plans, should be delayed while the GLA found resources to deal with the, I think there's over 30 opportunity areas in London.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. Could that, I mean, noting what you've said about the station planning brief, but could we have that added to the examination website, please?
Well, would you like to add it to the library for information? Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, I just want to touch on some matters in relation to policy D12.6 and explore part 2 a little bit further. In particular, I'd like the council's view on 2A, B and C, please. And those are the criterion Ms. Butler referred to earlier. And the first one in relation to tall buildings is their massing, bulk and height are appropriately sized and located and demonstrate they do not undermine local character and heritage assets and their settings through townscape analysis of short, mid and long views. B is they enhance the setting and or relationship with neighbouring heritage assets. And C is that they're of exceptional design and architectural quality. And I'd just like to kind of wrap those three things up together. And I'd just like the council's view in terms of the language and the consistency with national policy used. For example, use of the term exceptional. Does that align with the language in the MPPF? Is it justified? Is that something that the council may wish to reflect on?
I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Mr. Warren, for this answer, but just for everybody's benefit, we are working off document LBM05, which includes all the modifications apart from the ones in historic income statements.
Sorry, just give me a minute, sorry. Okay. Thank you, Inspector, for those comments. So I think in relation to 12.6 part 2, particular reference to A, B and C, we do feel as though they're justified. As per London Plan Policy D9, Part C Criterion C, architectural quality and materials should be of an exemplary standard to ensure that appearance and architectural integrity of the building is maintained through its lifespan. I think that's one policy within the London plan which really puts out there that it must be exemplary. I think that language is consistent with they are of exceptional design. I think
Mr. Warren, just on that point, is exemplary the same as exceptional?
No. So I think,
Thank you.
I think in that respect, then I think the ambition is there. I think we can review the language to reflect that ambition. Tall buildings, in particular, for borough like Merton, which is an outer borough, suburbia meets Metroland, meets inner London. I think tall buildings do stand out, and it must be that the policies reflect that ambition. Just also to note that our statement of common ground with Historic England, there's a new paragraph which is to reinforce the three criterions you mentioned, which are A, B, and C. The new paragraph is in the supporting text, which is all proposals for tall buildings must take a design-led approach and be accompanied by adequate information demonstrating how the proposals comply with all the criteria within section 2 of this policy and within the London Plan policy on tall buildings to ensure that the proposal has positive visual, townscape and heritage impacts. The reason behind that additional piece of supporting text was to add an additional layer to ensure that adequate information was given at application stage to reinforce the criteria of A, B, and C. But I think it's important just to note, because we are questioning the language of those three points. But I think we will take those 3 points and look at the language of them to make it more reflective of London Plan language as well as the MPPF language.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. Noting what you've said, was there anything you wanted to add on B? That proposals, they enhance the setting and or relationship with neighbouring heritage assets.
Thank you, Inspector. I'll just take over for a moment, just to say in the statement of common ground between Historic England and the Council on tall buildings, that's OD13L. Historic England and ourselves are proposing a modification, or would like to propose a modification to D12.6 Part 2B. And that sentence would change from they enhance this, as it is at the moment, to they enhance the setting and significance of neighbouring heritage assets. And that's to reflect the desire to set a positive strategy for the historic environment and to better align with the MPPF and the Planning, Listed Building and Conservation Area Act 1990.
Yeah, I think with this one, in terms of the statutory duties that are in the Planning and Listed Buildings and Conservations Act, they talk about preservation, don't they, of settings, special interest, character and appearance, which seems to be a lower test than to enhance those things. So, and similarly with the framework, it talks about, I'm looking at paragraph 189 of the framework here, which says, talks about heritage assets being an irreplaceable resource and should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance. And further, just trying to find considering potential impacts, paragraph 199, great weight should be given to the asset's conservation. It also talks at 206 about local planning authorities should look for opportunities for new development within conservation areas and within the setting of heritage assets to enhance or better reveal their significance, but it says look for opportunities to do that. So, I mean, just taking those things together, and particularly the statutory test, what is the justification for that kind of higher test, specifically in relation to tall buildings? And is it actually achievable? I think we might move on to discuss this a bit further, but you know, some of this, and particularly with some of the modifications that that have come through the statement of common ground, they're pushing things, perhaps they're pushing this assessment perhaps further to the development management stage. So what confidence can we have at this stage that the kind of the development yields anticipated would be, particularly housing, would be delivered in the timescales that the plan sets out? It's a bit of a long-winded way of saying, you know, is it possible really to get that enhancement from tall buildings, or is it, do we say we're looking to conserve those things or preserve, and that's the baseline, and you know, it weigh in the proposal's favour if it actually enhances it?
I think if I just say as well, I think it's kind of a bit of a wider point as well, and it's kind of all to do with where the balance lies at this stage, or at the application stage. And I think ultimately it runs to effectiveness. You know, if there's a requirement that all tall buildings must enhance their setting, then it's correct, isn't it, that that's a slightly higher test, because you have a balancing exercise to carry out. You know, could you not have an application or a proposal in future where there isn't an enhancement of the setting? That building could never enhance the setting. I don't know, but that building could never enhance the setting, but the policy requires that it must enhance the setting. And I think I'd be interested as well in Miss Parsons' view as well, as to kind of, you know, where the balance lies really, kind of up front now, or leaving it kind of to the development management. And does those, my initial question was based on, you know, are those three parts in a way kind of like my colleague Inspector Fort said, imposing a higher bar for tall buildings, and where is the justification for that? Use of the term, for example, exceptional. And I think throughout the framework you'll probably find different words. We've already had exemplary in the London plan, so I think it's something that needs to be reflected on. Well, yeah, I had finished.
Oh, sorry. Yes, we will. I think what we've heard today from representations this morning is that there are strong views on tall buildings, particularly by Mr. Burton and Mr. Michael, who emphasise the concerns that come from some sections of the community on tall buildings, and the need to set those higher bars and the good strong design standards. And it's worth saying as well, we work very closely with Ms. Parsons on Historic England on coming up with the modifications that are proposed in OD 13L. But what we're hearing is, and what we will reflect on, and taking account of the views as well expressed in Regulation 19 representations, and in hearing representations that may want to see strong design standards for taller buildings, is that the language in A to C needs to be tightened up to better reflect the framework and also the London plan. And we'd like to work with Ms. Parsons in particular on that, not having discussed it with her apart from just said this now. One other modification I would point out that I'm afraid I forgot is that we proposed with Ms. Parsons in Historic England on Criterion A to reflect the London plan's approach to take account of individual and cumulative effects when doing townscape analysis and issues of such as that. That is fairly extensively written in the London plan, and we don't need to repeat the London plan, but we would like to reference it here. So in summary, picking up on your points, inspectors, we will reflect on where the balance lies. Is the higher bar that we have set about exceptional design justified, and should we be working more closely within the MPPF's approach to design on tall buildings and the London plan's approach on design tall buildings? And we'll do that with Ms. Parsons if she's willing.
Yeah, I think that to simplify what I was sort of rambling on about before, but you could get a scheme that preserved the setting of all these heritage assets, but nevertheless it had conflict with the development plan because that requires enhance. So automatically you've got a section 38.6 balance to do at the planning application stage. And is that an effective way of managing those issues? I mean, it might be if there's a justification for it. You know, we'd like to hear it, but that's our views from reading the policy taken together with proposed modifications. That's our initial views. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Inspector Aston? But we'll bring Ms. Parsons in now.
Thank you. Yeah, I can just try and address some of those comments. The language is, as you say, it can always be a little bit tricky given the different language across the Act and the MPPF, and particularly in terms of the Act only relating to certain heritage assets, not all of them. It's not particularly relevant to this this hearing and this examination, but I think the issue has been recognised in the proposed planning, levelling up and regeneration bill, which includes amendments to this legislation to deal with this exact problem and get parity of language across all the heritage assets. The point of part 2 is, sorry, let me just get it here. The point of part 2 and the reason why we suggested the word significance in terms of part B, I think it was that does reflect the MPPF and covers all heritage assets rather than trying to untangle it to address each individual asset and the slightly different bits of language that are needed across all of those. It is different for conservation areas, registered parks and gardens, listed buildings, things like that. So that's why we went with that. And given that the separate heritage policy, which isn't the subject of this stage 1 examination, does reflect the language of the Act more accurately, and that is the relevant place to do it. I think in terms of, I see what you mean about the issue of enhancement, and I think that came from the MPPF paragraph 8, which does allow boroughs to place an emphasis on enhancement if that is indeed their objective, if that's their vision. We think that you can enhance heritage assets through tall buildings in various ways. If there can be all sorts of heritage benefits attached to maybe things like repair of heritage assets or removing negative buildings, things like that. So it is possible, but yeah, we do see what you're saying, and that could be overcome with a minor amendment to that. And then with regards to yeah, potentially the word undermine could be amended as well to conserve. But yeah, so effectively what we were thinking about was looking at the MPPF rather than trying to tangle up each individual asset and the different language associated with that.
Thanks, Ms. Parsons. That's understood. Yes, and I think the significance does create more clarity. The use of that word significance and consistency across those different sorts of heritage assets. So that's a welcome change. Yeah, I think the objective could still be to enhance settings. I think that's it's a reasonable objective to have. But it's just a question of whether that's the sort of floor target, if you like, if that's the threshold that everything has to get over before it's acceptable.
Okay, I think, Ms. Parsons, you made a point at the end there about not slightly overcomplicating things, but that's the kind of gist, and and obviously we're looking for some simplification and some clarity, if you like. And I think on that basis, I'd ask: is it clear what individual and cumulative effects mean to a decision maker? So that's kind of the first point in terms of that modification, adding to D12.6, new part 2, Criterion A. And we heard earlier about setting through townscape analysis of short, mid and long views, taking into account individual and cumulative effects. There's a question for us as to whether that's sufficiently clear and articulated in the plan. Noting what you said about the language, and also noting the general, I call it the general modification that is being proposed, and it appears to be for the site to be included in the site allocations, and that is approach to tall buildings, refers to strategic heights diagram, and then it says, however, all building heights will be subject to consideration of impacts on existing character, heritage and townscape in accordance with policies, and then it refers to D12.3, D12.5, D12.6, etc., and so on, depending on which site. And I think that's a welcome addition for clarity, perhaps, in reading the plan. But kind of moving on from that, we also have this suggested modification and a new paragraph after 12.6.7. All proposals for new buildings must take a design-led approach and be accompanied by adequate information demonstrating how the proposals comply with all the criteria within Section 2 of this policy and within the London Plan policy on tall buildings to ensure that the proposal has positive visual, townscape and heritage impacts. And the reason for that modification is given that the totality of the plan provides an additional layer of heritage protection. 2 points there I'd make. Why is there an additional level of heritage protection in Merton? And what is the purpose of that paragraph? We're talking about the context of the totality of the plan. Is that modification necessary for soundness, given I'm sure you could point me to numerous places within the plan where it tells me to take a design-led approach to developments? So perhaps that's something we just want to reflect on. Ms. Butler.
Could just first of all say that, as I mentioned, it's very clear from representations we've received from the local community on Merton's local plan that heritage and heritage assets are extremely important, and that's come through very strongly. I will pass on to Ms. Parsons, who we worked with on this particular paragraph, and the sentence you read out is contained in the OD13L.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a few points there, so let me try and go over those If I've forgotten any, do let me know. So I think the first, I'll start with the new paragraph 12.6.7. This is, from our point of view, we think it's really important to emphasize the need for adequate information. This is something that's come out very strongly in our revised guidance note on tall buildings, and we appreciate that our guidance is only guidance, but it is guidance that has been produced in consultation with the public, the heritage sector, and had to be signed off by government as well. So that is best practice. And I think given some of our concerns with the high level evidence up front, there is a greater need then to allow or enable officers to request the information that they need then to make a decision if they feel it is lacking, and also to highlight and provide some clarity for applicants so they know what the issues are to consider from the outset. And when we were talking about an additional layer of protection, that just a bit of clarification, that doesn't mean placing Merton particularly with a higher bar. It is to provide that layer of protection due to some of the evidence issues up front. So that was a way of trying to resolve that problem and square that circle. So we do think it is necessary to do that and to ensure that all the relevant criteria are reflected in the submitted documentation upon application.
Sorry, just on that point,
Yeah.
Ms. Parsons and Ms. Butler, just following on from that, I'll just maybe ask the council and you to reflect on maybe the location of that text. Would it be better incorporated in policy part 3? Part 3S talks about proposals for tall buildings should be supported by, and then it gives that townscape analysis, an analysis of its impact on their setting, in particular their impact on heritage assets such as parks or buildings and open spaces. I just wonder whether there's an opportunity to maybe reflect on where that is included in the policy. Just thinking out loud, just following the comment that you just made.
Was that directed at me or Ms. Butler?
It's directed at both of you, whoever wants to take the point.
Yeah, I'll go first with that one. I would agree, but in discussions with the council, the purpose of the justification was to supplement that specific part of the policy. But if we, if it's considered appropriate to agree an amendment to include it into part 3, that would be ideal for us. But what we've suggested is was agreed in consultation with the council after they'd explained their rationale behind that.
Thank you. No, I understand that, and I just following on. Part 3 talks about tall building proposals being supported by, and the new modification talks about adequate information of how the proposals comply with all of the criteria. And I'd say, well, potential issue there with whether you could. No, I'll park that. I think there should just be a reflection on where that modification is included, either as supporting text or in the policy. I think that's something that you should perhaps reflect on, have a bit more conversation about. Ms. Butler.
Yes, we'll reflect on that. I think initially we felt that it was simply emphasising, as you'd expect, all of the criteria in every policy to result in the applicant providing evidence, but we will reflect on including that.
Did anyone else have any comments around the table, or anyone else on Zoom on Mr. Michael?
Yes, I had a comment on this enhancement point, but although we seem to have moved off slightly. Is it okay?
Yes.
I think the design circulars and further documents in NPPF and so forth have often used the phrase conserve or enhance from the almost from the very start. That must be, about 20-something years. And I think that the council is right to say enhance, because there is a presumption, I feel, of not just leaving things okay, but because, and here comes the justification, because tall buildings, whether or not I would agree with that, but because tall buildings are tall, they have an effect which is greater than the building which normally fits in because it's the same as the others kind of stuff. So I feel that as tall buildings have an effect that is rather wider perhaps than their immediate locality, it is right to say that they must pass certain additional criteria. And that it is right, in my opinion, of the council to say enhance. So I very much hope that that will stay in the plan. There is another point about, I think, in one of the criteria about exceptional design quality. I don't know whether you want to go on to that one.
The point about exceptional, Mr. Michael, was this kind of issue about reflecting on whether that's consistent with the language in national policy, or what justification there is for the term exceptional when perhaps you look at national policy and you see words like high quality, good quality. That was the point on that.
Just sort of in passing, the idea that an architect will say, I happen to be an architect as well as a planner, that an architect would say, my building is actually jolly ugly. No. Every architect will always say that their building is marvelous. That is, we're all human. So we would always say that, wouldn't we? So exceptional design quality, my goodness, there are buildings that have been built which were in their time applauded and lauded by the architectural press, and which now are regarded as, shall we say, less than desirable. I don't really want to particularly quote, but some of the work by the Smithsons, some of the work by Goldfinger and so forth, are now, as it were, in the popular imagination, major candidates for demolition. But at the time, they were lauded as being high up in the architectural pantheon. And you have the other one as well, of course, the ones that were derided when they were built, but now are regarded as really rather nice. So I think that one of the criteria that the council is using, which is of architectural quality, was it Sam Goldwyn said, include me out. I don't really feel that it's possible for the planning system to have much success when it tries to work on architectural quality. My view would be, leave it to the architect, get the townscape right, get the urban design right, and the rest will follow. Sometimes you say, oh my gosh, but trying to draw the architect's elevations for them is a mug's game. And however, all the other criteria I think are entirely admirable.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Ms. Parsons, you have your hand up.
Thank you. You asked a question about cumulative impacts as well, so I thought I would give an answer on that if that would be helpful. Yep.
Yeah, it was just whether you should reflect as to whether it's clear what is meant by individual and cumulative effects for the purposes of the plan. That was all.
Oh, okay.
You're welcome to comment, Ms. Parsons.
Yeah, so the reason that we were quite keen to get that in was to reflect the various parts of the London plan, which particularly HC1 on heritage, which deals with individual and cumulative harm to avoid incremental harm to heritage assets. Another reason why it's so important, particularly in London, is that development is happening quickly. The character of areas can change quite a lot, so it's important to take into account other approvals that may not be built. Again, in our experience, we have been seeing sites coming forward in a salami slicing way, where applicants know that they're planning other types of development, but not including those in any EIA assessments or any modelling, things like that. So it's increasingly becoming a practical problem in our experience. So having that in there is helps direct decision makers to ensure that they are taking that into consideration, and helps applicants understand the sorts of things they need to be putting forward in their applications.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Parsons. Mr. Michael.
A couple of points of detail on individual sites in the Wimbledon town centre, but I don't know whether you want to take them now.
No, we'll come back to those,
Right.
Mr. Michael, please. Okay, so unless there's anything else, I'm going to give Ms. Butler the opportunity to wrap up in a moment. But just one final question from me, or comment, as it were. We talked a lot about the character study earlier, acknowledging the council's view that it's not the only document that has informed the approach. But there is a modification which 12.6.5, Merton's Borough Character Study, provides more detail of the different character areas within the borough. Previously, it gives holistic guidance on best practice design approach, highlighting the importance of a site's suitability and sensitivity. And my question on that is, do you think it's sufficient, given the weight that I understand from this morning's discussion the council place on the character study? What does that tell me as a developer, as an applicant? Is there perhaps a halfway house between the two? You know, that at the moment is just perhaps saying, well, it provides more detail of the different character areas within the borough. Well, thank you. I didn't expect it would do anything else. Is there anything that the council would want it to perhaps go a little bit further in doing?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes, the amendment proposed in OD 13, OD 13L with the council's statement of common ground with Historic England on the tall building policy has perhaps resulted in maybe too great a change between our original wording and what was proposed in this modification. I think it's fair to say, and I'd invite Ms. Parsons to correct me if I'm wrong on this, that Ms. Parsons' concern, as she expressed earlier, or was expressed, is that the character study by its nature looks at a very wide range of issues. She was concerned that it could be considered policy, and she was concerned, I think, that one of the many issues it looked at was access to public transport and access to open space. So it contains information to say it might be possible to have taller buildings with where things are wider, like with a big vista, as you might find with open space. And she was concerned with the conflict potentially, not supporting tall buildings in every single part of the borough that's 400 metres of near open space. Now, it's clear from our plan that that is not what we're doing. And we believe that it's very clear that the borough character study is an SPD, it was adopted as such, and that the plan is policy. However, subject to Ms. Parsons' agreement, we will absolutely take away to see if we can get a balance between making sure it's clear that the SPD is not policy, and also reflecting more of the benefits of the character study, which we do feel is more than just detail of the different character areas.
Okay, thank you. Okay, does anybody else want to make any comments in relation to these matters before we move on? Okay, thank you. Before we move on to the allocations, I'm just going to take our issue 3, questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Just taking questions 1 to 5 first, unless anyone wishes to add anything to that. We've received the answers to these in the hearing statement. Obviously, we deal with them on that basis, and we have touched upon some of them. I'd just ask the council if the council could explain the proposed modifications in terms of the estate's local plan. That's our question 6. Obviously, then invite any views on that. And then also the same for the modifications proposed in respect of question 7, which is the SPD referred to in policy D 12.6. I think part P is removed as part of MM 3.1. There's a lot of letters and a lot of numbers, so I think you've got the gist of that. Those are the only 2 questions that we have on those questions, and then following that, we can move on to the allocation, starting with CW2.
Thank you, Inspector. Briefly, Merton's Estates local plan was adopted in 2018, and it sets out very detailed design guidance to support the regeneration of 3 specifically defined housing estates in the borough: High Path, Eastfields and Ravensbury. It's a separate development plan document, and there are no proposals to override that fairly recently adopted document by the introduction of this new local plan. And for 2 of the estates, High Path and Eastfields, it proposes buildings that are taller than 21 metres. Not, as I said, universally, but parts of the estate can be taller than 21 metres. Therefore, for consistency, we propose a modification to policy 12.6 part 1 to clarify that tall buildings are only acceptable in the following locations, and Criterion E would add the phrase Merton's adopted estates local plan 2018. It is also the case that the 3 sites, Ravensbury, High Path and Eastfields, are already contained on Merton's policies map, so there is a site boundary definition there. Secondly, the other point on question 7, as set out in your statement, was regarding supplementary planning documents. And initially our regulation 19 local plan was maybe less clear than it could have been regarding the weight to be attributed to supplementary planning documents, which are guidance and not policy. And therefore, throughout the plan, in quite a number of places, including in policy D 12.6, we're proposing a modification to say that policy decision makers and applicants should have regard to supplementary planning documents rather than be informed by.
Thank you. Just on the estates, Ms. Patel or anybody else online, was there anything you wanted to add?
Thanks, inspectors. I think the only thing I'd like to highlight is, and I think it was in our representations throughout the plan making process and in the hearing statements, is we obviously support the consistency brought into the tall building policy, where tall buildings are identified as acceptable within High Path and Eastfields. That is consistent with the estates level plan. I think one of the points we made was generally about consistency across the plan, and whether policy N7.1, which relates to the South Wimbledon area, should better reflect the importance of the High Path estate regeneration in the delivery of the objectives and aspirations set out in the policy. So the estate regeneration is I think, throughout the evidence base and in the character study, identified as a very important part of the delivery of the improvements at South Wimbledon, the creation of the local centre, the improvements to the public realm, and in terms of the delivery of housing, I guess, as part of the opportunity area within which it lies. At the moment, I don't want to go into too much on this because it's another policy, but the South Wimbledon policy at the moment doesn't, for example, confirm that tall buildings would be acceptable. Every other area policy where tall buildings are identified as acceptable, for example, Morden, Collieswood and Wimbledon, have had modifications added in to reflect the acceptability of tall buildings in the area policy. So that's something that's not in South Wimbledon policy at the moment. And at the moment, there is support and a mention of the High Path estate within Part J of the South Wimbledon policy. But I think from our perspective, the estate regeneration is going to be a primary development within that area, which is going to help deliver everything or a lot of these things that the policy is aspiring towards. And I think that there's some potential modifications that could be had to emphasise that further.
Thank you, Ms. Patel. I mean, we're going to talk about the neighbourhood policies in more detail at stage 2, but just at this stage, it's just a question of whether any consequential modifications are needed in terms of consistency on that point that Ms. Patel's raised. You know, if tall buildings are acceptable at High Path, then does that need to be reflected in the relevant neighbourhood policy? So if I can leave that with you, Ms. Butler, to consider, or any reflections on that at this point?
Just very briefly to say that South Wimbledon is perhaps unique in that it doesn't contain sites for allocation. So all the other areas contain sites for allocation. South Wimbledon is proposed as a new local centre. So this is new in the local plan, and the policy focuses on that. A High Path is reflected in the Criterion J of the policy, as Ms. Patel said. So we believe it's not appropriate to, if you like, High Path is a site. It's considered as a site suitable for tall buildings in the estate's local plan. It's not like Collier's Wood and other places marked as an area on a strategic diagram. So should High Path have been allocated as a site in this local plan, then we would have said, yes, suitable for tall buildings. However, we don't feel there's any point in repeating the fact that High Path is suitable for tall buildings in this plan when it's already established in the estate's local plan. It's already mentioned in Criterion J that High Path is really important in the South Wimbledon policy, and it's already mentioned in policy 12D 12.6 part A, which talks about the estate's local plan being appropriate. And at the back of my mind always is there's lots of comments that the plan is already too long, so we're trying to remove repetition.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on now to some of the allocations. In particular, just before we discuss CW2, Ms. Butler, could you just say a few words on the rationale and assumptions behind the unsuitability for tall buildings for MI11, please? And just for clarity, this is a modification in the Statement of Common Ground. And that is MM 4.2, Raleigh Gardens car park, MI11, site is not appropriate for a tall building.
Yes, apologies. We've proposed this modification because no, that was just the drafting error in the plan. The site was never assessed as being suitable for taller buildings. I think we might have added an extra 1 to MI1 and ended up, which is suitable, and ended up with MI11.
I can certainly see how that's done. Okay. I'd just like to explore, moving on to CW2, I'd just like to explore some of the change between the stage 2A and Reg 19 consultation in respect of Britannia Point as a pinnacle building. What was the further analysis and feedback briefly that led to the change in approach?
This relates to site CW2 Britannia Point, which is beside an existing tower, Britannia Point, which is 19 stories. And this site, the existing tower at Britannia Point and the site CW2 in this plan is the only place in Collier's Wood that's outlined for tall buildings in a strategic heights diagram. Probably the easiest place to look for a summary of this is document OD8, which is the consultation statement, which looks right across all the consultation carried out on the local plan. At stage 2 in 2018, the council consulted on Britannia Point, being the existing building at Britannia Point being the pinnacle in terms of height in Collier's Wood, recognising the significant height difference between Britannia Point and the rest of the surrounding buildings in Collier's Wood, recognising the views from the Wandle Trail and the Wandle Park to the west, and recognising the characteristics of land, particularly to the north, which is predominantly some 4 stories, but predominantly 2 to 3 story buildings. At stage 2A, and considering feedback from stage 2, including from the site owner, we proposed to vary the policy. So the consultation at that point described site CW2 could be a part of a cluster of buildings of varying heights. That wouldn't necessarily mean the existing 19 stories was the pinnacle, but it could be a cluster of buildings of varying heights. And that was in response to representations received, including from the landowner at site CW2. At consultations, while there was, we believed at the time there may be some worthy considerations of that, it's important, given the sensitivities and the significant heights in relation to the surrounding area, this will be tested at consultation. And the consultation feedback at stage 2A from very much the majority of people, I think we received a petition and we received lots of responses. And these are also echoed in the responses received at stage 3. So there are regulation 19. There are some respondents to regulation 19, which are contained in OD7 and summarized in OD6, which supports Britannia Point being the pinnacle and are very resistant to anything taller than 19 stories. Therefore, with the wealth and volume of responses received at stage 2A, the council relooked at the site and considers that the existing 19-story tower at Britannia Point should remain the pinnacle in terms of height. And that is what is in the council's plan.
Okay, so we heard a bit about the status of the application yesterday. We touched upon that 21P0082. Did that in any way inform the view, do you think, of you say that you're basing the change on comments made? The application, presumably people would have been aware of the application at the time.
I might ask the site owner to come in, but the application I think was submitted in early 2021. So that would have been at the end of, it was in February 21 and the consultation ended in February 21. So I think there was probably a matter of days or weeks between the application coming in and the consultation finishing. I cannot recall whether the applicant did pre-application consultation and put forward their proposals, but there was a bit of a gap in terms of weeks between our consultation at stage 2A finishing and the application coming in. And we can get more precise dates if that interests you. I think it's fair to say that at no stage that either at stage 2A, which proposed the varying heights, or at stage 2, it didn't reflect the precise details of the application. It didn't, I think the application, I look to the gentleman over there, I think the application is for 2 buildings, one of 26 stories and one of less than 19. And no, the application, the council's plans didn't slavishly reflect exactly what was in the application. It wasn't the only thing used for analysis.
Mr. Ford will get his chance in a moment, but I just wanted to explore a little bit more in terms of that evidence. To what is it justified, the approach? I've heard design-led quite a few times this morning. Is it really justified in a design-led approach, or using a design-led approach, to limit the height of development in this location? And I think I'd like to explore a little bit more about the significance of what we're talking about here, because I've heard the term significant. And I'd pose a couple of questions there. You know, Have the visual and cumulative impacts been subject to any detailed analysis? And in effect, in light of the Quod rep, you know, it's this issue, isn't what's the significance of this additional, I'm going to say 7 stories, but I could be, you know, wrong there. I'm sure Mr. Ford will clarify. And in light of the issues that the raised in that representation, you know, the justification for Britannia Point to remain the pinnacle using a design-led approach. Do you think in this location, the approach sets an unnecessary cap on development? For example, the Quod statement talks about ranges of stories being acceptable. And in using a design-led approach, or sorry, in a design-led world, if you like, would that be a more appropriate approach? Thank you.
I think the council needs to strike a balance between our conformity with the London plan and clarity in our local plan, which has come across very strongly at Regulation 19. I think throughout the plan making process, we didn't use the precise language that we're now proposing in our modifications. We used much more in terms of varying height or taller buildings, or without the precision that really we are required to take forward under conformity with the London plan. And we are always conscious that the issue of the London plan was introduced by the Secretary of State in December 2020 as a modification to the London plan itself. So this is also a government approach about clear and precise. So even if there hadn't been a reassessment and a overwhelming majority of responses on this site saying that they felt that the 19-story building should be the pinnacle, even if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be proposing to introduce a policy that talked about varying heights without being a bit more precise, because we don't feel we could strike a balance between the clarity we are required to put forward at this stage to be in conformity with the London plan versus the flexibility, arguably extreme flexibility, that a phrase such as varying heights would allow for. We did test this at consultation at stage 2A. That's exactly what we proposed as set out in both OD 8 and in the Quod statement to the hearing. But we don't feel that we could sustain a phrase like that and still be in compliance with the necessary clarity and justification that we're required to put forward.
Okay, so the concerns in terms of significance, can you just touch on that, the additional heights and stories? What are we in effect talking about here in terms of additional stories? You'd like to limit the height because Britannia Point remains the focal point, therefore. I suppose the question is more, is there in a design, again, in a design-led world, is there an approach where there could be some opportunities for that still to remain? I think it's this issue of pinnacle. What you know, look at the approach in Morden, for example. Is the Civic Centre a pinnacle building given where it's located? But the same approach, obviously, you know, hasn't been taken with that. I just kind of want to still not quite clear as to why in this particular location. It seems from what you've said, Miss Butler, that forgive me, it seems to be more about the representations than actually a analysis of whether taller buildings on this site are appropriate. That's what I'm getting from the responses I've heard this morning.
Thanks. So I think the history of this building is quite interesting in terms of it was voted Europe's ugliest building. It's a 1960s hang up. Its location, albeit by a tube station, is also by two-story terraced homes. I think that with the context in mind and the fact that Wandle Park and the conservation area, the Wandle Valley Conservation Area spanning across south to north across the site, this site poses the opportunity to reconcile the kind of the kind of bad things which happened before. So in that regard, we believe from an urban design perspective that it should remain the pinnacle. It's been reclad, it looks a lot better, it's now homes. And the other buildings should be stepping up towards it. We feel as though if the buildings were taller than it, not only would it lose focus and not only would it step away with the height being away from the station, it would also potentially cause significant harm to neighbouring homes. And I think it's that balance which we're trying to achieve. And that's why we believe that the existing Britannia Point should remain as a pinnacle.
My apologies, I had my microphone off. Just before I come to Mr. Ford, is optimal use being made of this site in accordance with National Planning Policy Framework, particularly thinking paragraphs 119, 130C? You referred earlier to the Wandle Park. Okay, we might accept that it could be seen from the Wandle Park. And I'd be careful my words here. It's a word I'd potentially use section 78. And what's the significance of that? Just the fact that it could be seen from Wandle Park. Visibility doesn't necessarily equate to any harm. I think you understand the point that I'm making.
Paragraph, I think you referred to paragraph, is it 119 of the framework, and paragraph, sorry, I didn't catch the second reference.
Apologies, it was 130C, 119, but it's just this general point of on this particular site in this location, is that being optimized in accordance with those objectives?
Yes, I'm going to start by saying we think it is. It's despite the proposals, it's actually a fairly modestly sized site. It's the location of the site and the prominence of its location, looking down the Wandle Park vista, that is the issue. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, my urban designer colleague, who's having a little look at something here.
Take your time, Mr. Warren.
Sorry, Inspector, could you repeat your question just so it's fresh? Sorry.
Yes, certainly, Mr. Warren. It's just really whether, given its location, optimum use is being made of this site in accordance with, I'm just going to say the gist of the framework.
Yeah.
And then pointed to those two paragraphs, 119, 130.
So I think given the kind of the constrained context of the site, I think that achieving a development which steps up to the existing Britannia Point would still enable you to have an optimized development. There are key views, key vistas when you're coming from Tooting down into Colliers Wood. Britannia Point is the focal point. When you're coming from South Wimbledon into Colliers Wood, Britannia Point is the focal point. From multiple angles, it is very significant in terms of wayfinding, in terms of urban design, in terms of marking where the station is. I think in terms of justifying the amount of development, whether or not it's viable, is something which we still need to take away and reflect based off of what we've put in our policies. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Mr. Warren, are the council aware of any issues relating to potential failure to accommodate affordable housing, deliver infrastructure from limiting the height proposed?
Yes, I think as we touched on last week, and we do want to keep in all cases, we want to keep planning applications separate from site allocations. So I don't want to get too involved, but I think it's fair to say, and as we've said in statements, that the application's been in for over a year. Many issues have been resolved. The two outstanding issues relate to height and viability, but that it should be noted that that's for that particular scheme, the reference of which I don't have, but I think you quoted it earlier, Inspector. And we do feel that with the building, Britannia Point as being 19 stories already, that there are, and this is talks about 2 buildings on the CW2 site, that there are opportunities to step down without a significant loss of developments. And there's definitely a range of options that could be looked at in terms of the heights of those 2 buildings. I think I'll leave it there because I'm worried about the application discussion.
So just one point of clarification and going back to the allocation, not the application. So, Mr. Warren, you referred to potential effects on, I presume it's residential amenity of those adjacent properties. So generally, is that sort of light, shading, outlook, microclimatic effects, perhaps? And would they, would they be? So it's difficult to say, isn't it? But would they be materially worse if Britannia Point wasn't taken as the pinnacle building?
Sorry, Inspector, could you repeat the last bit of that? Would there be material?
Yeah, so I suppose just thinking about those impacts that you've touched on, so and talking about the scale that's recommended in the strategic heights diagram. So say that if we were to say, well, buildings on the allocation can be as high as, let's just say, Britannia Point. So is there an analysis of whether those impacts that I've sort of touched on would be like materially worse if it was 19 stories rather than 15?
Sorry, give me a second.
Mr. Michael, did you have a general point or specific point you wanted to make whilst Mr. Warren's looking for that information?
Yes, thank you. Now, without wanting to comment on this particular case, you did raise an interesting question, which was, in effect, does a tall building, because you can see it, does it matter, so to speak? Does it affect character? Just as an example, nothing to do with this case, Hyde Park. When you're in the middle of Hyde Park, looking from the center, looking eastwards, when all the trees are in leaf, in the 1960s probably, you would not have known how far you could see the park going because there was nothing to tell you where it was. And then the Hilton Hotel was built on Park Lane, and suddenly you saw the tower emerging above the tree mass. And so you could say to yourself, that is the edge of my park. Now, I leave that as a concept, because did that, to me, did that diminish the nature of the park? Well, in my view, yes, it did, because you could imagine yourself in the middle of just park. Now you know that you're in an urbanized park with a periphery, with a curtain around it. And so moving it to our own locality, Wimbledon Common, for example, along the road on the eastern side, more or less, park side, very important in that case to keep the building height down so that it is below the level of the leafed trees. You can, of course, in the winter you can see, but at the moment there are no buildings that go above that, so that you can get this feeling of, the old phrase, Russin urbe, or whatever it is, you can get the feeling of there is no edge to where I'm sitting. Now that's purely as an example, and it may not work, or it may work. That's it for the council to say on the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I understand the point, and I think I'd just say for clarification that we will be taking in site visits, and we will view some of those points where it's visible from. Mr. Warren.
Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, I think the difference between stepping from 15 to 19, I think it's more that it exacerbates the kind of shading, the microclimatic changes, the quality of the public realm from overshadowing and things like that. I think also it's important to note that if we look at Collier's Wood as what it is, and you'll see this when you go on your site visits, it is heavily constrained. This would be kind of the first step in Collier's Wood to regeneration. However, the site which is immediately adjacent to this is big box retail, and it's big box retail because it's constrained by pylons. And so there isn't a way of stepping up to the tallest element if it was to be 26 stories from that side of the site without a landowner really willing to bury pylons with extreme viability issues. So I think that's if we think we have to think about CW2 in a holistic way in terms of its in 50 years what would Collier's Wood be, and that's why the pinnacle, the existing Britannia Point, works as it steps up towards it from that side.
Just to say, I wasn't trying to confuse with the reference to additional stories or any reference to the application. It's kind of the general point of is the capacity being optimized in a design-led approach? Could there be, additional development there? And I think this is a very opportune point to invite Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford, thank you for your patience. I appreciate there's a fair bit in there, but you know your statement and the points that you have made. And I think it's probably perhaps useful to hear those points before giving you the opportunity to respond, rather than kind of back and forth. So would you want to comment, please?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing us to appear today and make the hearing statement. We do appreciate that. And I'll keep it fairly succinct. I think our understanding of the chronology really was that the pre-application discussions that took place with the council in respect of the detailed design-led approach to assessing views, assessing the planning application as such in real time, led to the council taking a view that they could amend slightly the historic pinnacle point, which had been in there since at least the 2011 core strategy. So that pinnacle point was an urban design point from many moons ago. And through the pre-application work, we got to a position where we, I think, had convinced the local authority that there could be a different approach. Obviously, that went out for public consultation, and that changed as a result of a significant number of residents' objections, which we totally understand. I'm not sure there was any design analysis that resulted in that change outside of just public concern and an objection. And I think it is probably fair to say that it was the level of objection that resulted in a change rather than any design-led evidence. I think the pinnacle point is important, but actually because of the struggles that council are having, every local authority in London is having with D9, the interpretation of D9, Secretary of State's involvement, but also the very binary nature of it. We have a number of tall building applications across London, and each local authority is trying to deal with it. The GLA are being very, very prescriptive about what you can do and you can't do, which we think is a little bit unfair. There is this general conformity point where the GLA is saying you must do this, but from experience on other EIPs, we've referred to the Brent local plan recently, which was adopted after the London plan was adopted, so D9 was tested. They ended up with tall building height AODs, but actually incorporated some wording into their local plan that I think allowed for the necessary flexibility, because this process simply cannot allow the level of detail required to inform prescriptive building heights. It's just, you know, the local plan process isn't set up for that. So I think the Brent plan has come out actually as a really good example of some flexibility. We've got the pinnacle point, but we've also got the strategic heights diagram point that refers up to 15 stories. So I guess our representations were that, you know, respectfully, we didn't want to be capped at Britannia Point being the pinnacle. But also we didn't think that there was really any design evidence to justify 15 stories. You know, why couldn't it be 18 stories or 17 stories or whatever it might be? And 15 just felt like a slightly arbitrary figure, which was lower than Britannia Point, but still a tall building, or gave credence for a tall building. So I think what we have said is, we think the pinnacle point doesn't really have any justification. It's a legacy policy. We've respectively requested that the previous wording is reinserted. Moving on to the point about D9, the local authority are largely constrained by the obligations of D9, locations of tall buildings and setting maximum heights. That's just unfortunately the world we live in. We think the design analysis undertaken outside of this process, admittedly, allows for flexibility, allows for additional height beyond 19 stories. We've said 26 in our submission. Clearly, it's quite difficult because you don't have all of that work in front of you. But I think as a result of that complexity, what we are saying is the plan ought to allow for scenarios in a justifying text where height beyond these thresholds is submitted. And again, we've just used really the wording from the Brent local plan to propose this additional paragraph, which would sit in at the back of D12.6, the tall building policy, to allow for that. I think the other thing to say is that where we've done EIPs before, and it may be in here, and apologies if I haven't seen it, there is a recognition that the plan has to be read as a whole. There is a recognition that there are a myriad of other policies in the plan. And, you know, we spend, and you know, it's great listening to the D9 conversation today. I'll probably spend most of my time talking about D9 on schemes, but it's, and the problem with D9 and the application to the local plan process is there's no real viability testing. So, you know, it's a design-led solution that will cap, in this case, 15 stories height. We don't think that 15 stories would deliver the council's proposed, not proposed capacity, that's the wrong word, would propose the 220 units that's in the housing delivery. We know that there will be effects on the delivery of the affordable housing policies, and therefore communities and everyone else gets funneled down a route where they think this building is going to come forward at 15 stories, but there's been no cross-referencing to all the other policies of the plan, and it's a kind of in a silo policy position, and therefore again the wording that in the Brent plan is quite good because it recognises that there may be scenarios, It recognises that there should be compliance with other policies of the plan as a whole. And in reality, we're all here to be delivering the site allocations. We're here to be delivering housing. We know that we're in an opportunity area. We know that traditionally the housing numbers, let's say they're around 500 delivery rate. I think we're up at a proposed 1,555 in 2028. So the expectation about housing delivery is huge, and therefore I think we've got to kind of try and patch together the design policies with actually the rest of the plan. Otherwise, we'll just end up coming forward with sites that aren't being delivered because they are being capped at the height threshold. I think that's probably it. I think the only way really to navigate through these requirements is to insert some qualifying text to allow a recognition of a degree of flexibility, bearing in mind that the GLA are telling local authorities that they have to provide maximum building heights. And also in reality, we don't have, and I think it's possibly across a lot of local authorities, some do more evidence than the others, but we don't have necessarily an evidence base to justify 15 stories in this case. And that evidence base often will come through the planning application process. So yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging situation, and we can only really look at how other local authorities have dealt with it, trying to deliver a degree of flexibility. Thank you.
Noting that my colleagues did use the term exceptional in that policy. Ms. Fuller, I've heard what Mr. Ford has to say. Do you have any response to that?
Thank you, Inspectors. Mr. Ford, I think it is accurate to say that if we look at the local plan library, it isn't possible to put your finger on one document that clearly provides the evidence for CW2. And maybe what we can propose that we do is look specifically at CW2, the strategic heights for CW2, and propose some evidence to be brought forward on that particular site prior to stage 2 of the hearings, because it requires looking at a myriad of documents, including, I don't have the references anymore, the conservation area character appraisals, and lots of London Plan and lots of other documents to pull together what my colleague Mr. Waring and myself have been saying.
So in those terms, I think that the topic paper approach might be appropriate. That it's similar to the economic papers that you produced in response to our preliminary matters, because it's drawing together, as you say, those disparate elements with some analysis of how that's informed your approach. So I think that will be useful.
Just to clarify there, a topic paper on tall buildings that summarizes some of the extensive information, but also provides information that has to be drawn together from what's in the exam library already.
Is that not what you were proposing?
Yes, that is. I was just thinking that.
Yes,
sure it was.
Yeah. So yeah, that'd be a useful approach. And specifically, I think because this site is kind of on its own, as we've said, you know, it's an area where tall buildings would be acceptable according to the plan, but that's the only allocation that it's relevant to. I think perhaps, and we've said with Morden and Wimbledon, there's more context there, isn't there? So I suppose there is a bit of a gap there. You haven't got the gap because you said we've drawn together all these different pieces of evidence, but you know, to assist those, I think that will be a useful piece of work. Sorry, continue, please, Ms. Butler.
Yes, it's absolutely accepted. I would, again, I don't have the reference in front of me, but obviously we've looked at the viability of the plan as a whole. We have an extensive viability study, which we've updated with the climate change policies as well. And that is distinct from the viability of specific planning applications that we've spoken about already. So with those two modifications, with the proposal of a topic paper, we hope it will draw together this evidence, but we do believe that the site can be viable, and considering all the other policies as well. Sorry, 11D7 is the housing viability study. Yeah.
So we're going to break for lunch now. But just before we do, Mr. Ford, so you've heard what the council said about drawing that material together in a topic paper. We've got the stage 2 hearings due for October. So that'll be the appropriate point to discuss that further. So we'll be, I mean, like we did with this session, we'll be issuing matters, issues and questions in due course. So once those are published, we'll put something on specifically about that piece of work. So as we've got a couple of other questions about CW2, but I suggest we take those after lunch. So no, we don't have any more questions about CW2. So we'll take a lunch break now. I think we'll have a slightly shorter one today, 3/4 of an hour. So if we can adjourn and come back at 2:15. Thank you.
So can I just ask, will you, C2 presumably has now been closed as an item, and there'll be other sites going discussed after lunch, is that the case?
That's correct. There are some other sites being discussed after lunch.